It takes a village to organize a successful book talk series. As you can see from the overhead, it really does take a village. And I'm very grateful, and I can't do these book talks alone, and I would like to thank the two research assistants in the center who worked very hard up until this very minute to make this book talk successful. Devo Abawale Dilakal, he said I screw up his name every time, but I'll get better. Devo, I'll stand up so they can see who you are. And then Devo is from Nigeria, and Tao Wang, Tao, where are you? Is from China, actually. We have a very global staff this year. And I'm from Arkansas, so we have a very global staff. And Karina, who's not here today, who's our student assistant, is actually Mexican-American. I assume she's Mexican-American. I actually never asked her. But her name is Karina Rivera. She's at least Latino. So I'd like to thank all of those folks for making this book talk successful. I'd like to thank our dean, Tom Studicus, who's not here, but a real supporter of the center. And he supports us in many ways. And let me say a little bit about the purpose of the book talk series. Is to stimulate dialogue among our faculty and graduate students within the College of Education, and an interdisciplinary dialogue among colleagues across campus about ways to increase the academic achievement of students, help all students develop positive racial attitudes, and become effective citizens of a democratic society, and to learn more about the histories and cultures of the various racial, ethnic, language, and cultural groups in the U.S. and around the world. And we draw people like Catherine Mitchell from geography, of course, Mike Hillis from PLU, who also went through the center for 3 years. Was it 3 years, Mike? He didn't want to go to Tennessee when he finished. I said, go to Tennessee. Do a good job. He said, no, I don't want to go there, Professor Banks. So he went there. I said, and now we have him back to the Northwest. I always have to argue with my students. They don't want to leave Seattle. But I said, go off and do great things in Tennessee, and you can come back. And Mike Hillis is an example of that. Okay, so we do draw people, and we have Paulette from the public schools. Oh, well, she was in the public schools. Where are you now, Paulette?
I'm over here.
Where are you working?
So physically, I teach here on campus. I'm still a graduate student in the College of Education. So I teach at Ivy Wells School for Social Justice, which is it's a joint endeavor with the College of Education, Office of Minority Affairs.
So we draw people from all over. Yeah. So we're glad to welcome you. Okay, the procedure. Professor Al will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes. We will then invite you to participation in a Q&A dialogue, and then we will have the book signing. You have to grab your books because there may not be enough to go around, so be sure to grab them as fast as I got mine already. So grab them as fast as you can. Professor Wayne Au is an assistant professor in the education program at the University of Washington, Basel, and he is the editor of the social justice teaching magazine, Rethinking Schools, and he told me he is not related to Kathy Au, who, by the way, has given a symposium at the center, and I thought maybe they were related, but they are not. But you're not from Hawaii.
My Chinese side is from Hawaii, for sure.
Yep. Chinese, so they both are from Hawaii.
We're probably related. Some way back we're related. Yeah.
Dr. Au is a product of the Seattle Public Schools and the University System of Washington State. He graduated from Garfield High School in 1990. I can't believe it, 1990. Oh my God, I have been here a long time. He graduated from high school. Oh well, some of us are old. He graduated from Garfield in 1990, and he received his bachelor's and master's in teaching from Evergreen State, which I didn't know until I read his bio. And he knows my good friend Michael Varus, who's there. He studied with Mike Apple at the University of Wisconsin, where he got his doctorate, and I won't hold that against him. Professor Au is the author of 2 books, Unequal by Design, High-Stakes Testing and the Standardization of Inequality, and Critical Curriculum Studies, Education Consciousness, and the Politics of Knowing. We do have the second book here, plus one of his other books. He edited Rethinking Multicultural Education, Teaching for Racial and Cultural Justice. I think that's the other one we have on sale today, which earned a 2010 Skipping Stones Honor Award. And he's co-edited 2 books, Rethinking Our Classrooms and the Routledge International the Routledge International Handbook of Critical Education. His upcoming book projects include co-editing a new Rethinking Schools book entitled Pencils Down, Rethinking High-Stakes Testing and Accountability in Public Schools, which is due out in early 2012. And with Professor Alford, he's editing a 4-volume Routledge Major Works in Critical Education, which will be published in 2013. I'm very pleased to welcome my friend and colleague, Professor Wayne Al, to the Center for Multicultural Education and to the Seattle campus. Professor Al, please join me.
Thank you so much. Let's see. Let's see if we can get this mysterious PowerPoint to actually go now. I was struck today parking my car in the garage and realizing that speaking of graduating high school locally, I used to spend a lot of time in the parking garages here because I used to skate. And in Seattle, it rains, and we would always, and get chased by security, but we would always, I just had sharp memories of grinding certain curbs in the garages and doing some other stuff. And the other thing which I wasn't prepared for when I got up here and thinking about doing this was actually I was just struck emotionally by sort of the spirit of a good friend of mine who graduated here, who passed, and some of you know Dr. Kipchoge Kirkland, and so for me to come back here and speak just sort of ushered up some of my memories and emotions around sort of missing him and wishing he were here to be here and be in this conversation. Today I want to talk about the relationship between curriculum and how we think about the world, and then how all this is wrapped up in political struggles over knowledge, what knowledge is valued, and what it means for us as educators interested in multicultural education, teaching for social justice, and educational equity in general. To give you a sense of how the talk will go, I'll begin by sharing some of my experiences as a teacher here in Seattle Public Schools, relate those experiences to some foundational considerations in epistemology and how we understand the world, and lay out a framework for what I'm calling curricular standpoint. I'll also offer some basic examples of curricular standpoint in practice, and I'll wrap up my thinking with some of my thinking about politics of the curriculum. All this, of course, appears in the book, and the core of these arguments actually will be appearing in a forthcoming piece with Teachers College Record next spring. And before formally starting my remarks today, I wanted to thank Dr. James Banks and the Center for Multicultural Education for giving me the opportunity to speak here. And indeed, I just want to say I've been fortunate to receive personal support from both James and Dr. Terry Banks, as well as Ed Taylor and Walter Parker and Brad Portine. All of these colleagues have offered me mentorship as I've tried for many years to get back home here to Seattle. And for those of you who are doc students now, and as Jim mentioned, that is one of those issues. Like some people say, don't get your PhD where home is, because you always have to leave, right? And so we've been working hard to get back here to our community and our friends and family. And I stand here in front of you today in part due to the support of these folks. And also, I wanted to give a shout out to I.W. Wells School for Social Justice here at the University of Washington. I was going to say, in my remarks I originally had written, I bet a fair number of you in the audience don't really know that there's a small alternative Seattle Public High School right here on campus, and that the school serves young people that have been pushed out of their traditional high schools. Even better is that they do so with a politically sharp curriculum. It's a program that I think is really deserving of our support, and I encourage all of you to contact my friends Paulette Thompson and also Rogelio Rigor, who also teaches there, and get involved with them, and sort of we're trying to work on building a relationship with the College of Ed and sort of help them survive what has turned out to be a pretty draconian Seattle Public School administration in terms of trying to get rid of small programs that actually serve quote-unquote at-risk youth. And actually, I want to start there. You see, I used to teach at a school just like the Ida B. Wells School for Social Justice. And it's my experience working there that drives much of my book, Critical Curriculum Studies. You see, my career as a credentialed social studies and language arts teacher began at Middle College High School at South Seattle Community College. Housed on the community college campus, Middle College was a small alternative high school for dropouts ages 16 to 21, former because these students had dropped out, or if we were to think more correctly, they had been pushed out of the regular high schools, but realized that they wanted another chance of graduating and getting their diploma. This was the job I wanted, and I loved teaching there. My students hailed from the vastly diverse working class families of South Seattle, and the majority of my students were always on the brink of being in a gang or dealing drugs or some sort of street-related life hustle, the brink of homelessness or unemployment, the brink of drugs and alcohol abuse, the brink of depression and suicide, the brink of going to jail, and always at the brink of serious health issues. And sometimes we lost students to these crises over the brink, never to return. I don't intend to sound overly dire here, but this was and is the reality of an increasing number of our students' lives today. As of 2009, for instance, even though they make up only 25% of the overall population, 42%, or roughly 31.3 million of the children in the United States live in low-income families. And it is fairly well established that poverty-related issues such as food insecurity and lack of adequate health care negatively impact educational success. But as a school for quote-unquote dropouts, we had a high concentration of students dealing with serious issues. Even in the midst of such struggles, though, our students were also always on the brink of educational success, too. They fought off demons of self-doubt and low skills in order to graduate. They were brilliant, passionate, and artistic, often culturally and politically aware, and certainly, in some regards, wizened well beyond their years. As I said before, I loved working with those students. They were feisty, they wouldn't tolerate bullshit, they lived passionately, and had wickedly sharp intellects and humor, and embodied so much potential to transform their own lives, a potential that manifested when they found the wherewithal to fight against the material and institutional constraints so present for them every day. When our students finished, everyone had serious reason to celebrate, so there was nothing quite like the joyous experience of a Middle College High School graduation. And to you students at Ida B. Wells, all that describes you as well. I don't even know y'all, but I know that's what Ida B. Wells is about. And for everyone else in the room, go to the Ida B. Wells graduation in June. All right, it'll make you want to stay a teacher. It'll make you want to be in education because you're going to see the power of what it means when these young people get their diplomas. In addition to having left the traditional high schools, my middle college students had at least one other thing in common. They were alienated from schools. Sorry, I'm like moving through all my stuff. They were alienated from schools and pretty much hated the education they experienced before landing in our classrooms. Emotionally, academically, culturally, socially, politically, and sometimes even physically scarred by their quote-unquote regular system of education, my students had what one might call a form of PTSD, post-traumatic schooling disorder. Such extreme alienation was what we tried to overcome at Middle College, and while we did not always succeed, we worked hard to create a learning environment where students could reclaim their education. In retrospect, I think that overcoming this alienation was the key factor to whatever successes we enjoyed, and we made use of two key strategies to do so. First, on most days and in a multiplicity of ways, we clearly demonstrated to our students that we cared for their emotional, social, physical, and educational well-being. Second, my co-teacher and I developed a culture of curricular resistance in our social studies, language arts, coordinated studies class. The premise of our curricular resistance was simple. We operated from the basic assumption that certain more politically critical perspectives of the world and the realities of social and historical relations had either been explicitly or implicitly denied our students in their previous education. This approach helped us overcome our students' built-in alienation and resistance to education because it validated their experiences and and their feelings about previous curriculum that did not connect to their lives. And at the same time, we acknowledged and explained what they experienced in their communities and in their world. Building from this assumption, keep getting ahead of myself. Building from this assumption, and it's an assumption that we explicitly talked about in our teaching, we then sought to develop a curriculum that recognized our students' social, cultural, and economic material realities and critically validated their experiences with power relations in their lives. In practice, this culture of curricular resistance meant that, for instance, when we taught U.S. history, we used Zinn's People's History of the United States, which provides the oft-neglected perspectives of many oppressed or marginalized groups in U.S. history. Or when we taught world history, we included books like Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America, which details the European colonization of the Americas, but places a high value on honoring the perspective and resistance of indigenous peoples. Or when the World Trade Organization met in Seattle in 1999, we engaged in a quarter-long study of globalization that paid particular attention to issues of economic exploitation in the global south, theft of indigenous and local knowledge, of plants and farming, and the environmental ramifications of neoliberal free trade, as well as the forms of resistance that were manifesting around the world at that time. As a result, our students produced a magazine about the World Trade Organization, and many decided to take part in the protests that year. What unites all of these examples is that, through them, we developed curriculum that spoke to the foundations of racism, sexism, and patriarchy, and class exploitation in this country. Curriculum that also pushed students to sharpen their thinking, writing, and critical literacy skills. In many ways, by functionally using what might be referred to as a Freirean curriculum of the oppressed, we made use of students' social locations, lived experiences, and material realities as a means for them to engage critically with both the world and academic knowledge and skills. Thus, this curriculum encouraged students to develop their skills to better understand the systematic relationships that impinged upon their very existence, with the hope that they would apply their learning to take control of their own lives by at least graduating, and perhaps moving into the world as agents of social change as well. So there are three interrelated points that are sort of driving my talk today. And in essence, the middle college story brings us to one of them. We're living in a period of sharp contrast and struggle over social, cultural, economic, and yes, even educational inequality. The Occupy Wall Street movement and the thousands of other Occupy movements in cities and towns throughout the U.S. and the world are testament to this reality. My former middle college students, like so many other students today, felt the brunt of such inequality, and the curriculum they got in school was simply not up to, in their regular school, was simply not up to the task of meeting the realities of their lives. So today, I'm going to argue strongly that we need a curriculum that is firmly rooted in the material realities of students' lives, particularly in the lives of the marginalized. And to be sure, such rooting means an equally firm commitment to multicultural education. The second interrelated point that drives my talk today is political. I feel like we are in the middle of a street fight surrounding multiculturalism and multicultural education. Looking globally, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark have seen steep increases in anti-immigrant political parties. Last year, France expelled its Roma population. Roma is the more correct name for what's popularly referred to as gypsy. In response to the influx of immigrants, Germany's Chancellor Merkel declared that the multicultural concept has failed and failed utterly, end quote. The fast-growing Italian political party, the Northern League, firmly backed one of its representatives who, as a political message, threw a pig's head on a site where a mosque was planned to be built. There are reports of homophobia on the rise in Russia, and with the support of political and religious groups, gay activists are commonly detained by authorities. Chile, Taiwan, Israel, and India have seen increases in hyper-nationalistic neo-Nazi movements calling for ethnic purity. Here in the United States, we just have to turn to the Texas Board of Education and the struggle over state standards for social studies that took place in 2010. To find a similar example, a domestic example of the street fight that I feel like we're in with multicultural education. The Texas Board of Education revisits the standards for teaching different subjects each year on a rotating basis, such that the social studies standards, for instance, are revised every 10 years. In 2010, the Texas Board of Education had a very powerful conservative evangelical Christian voting bloc of 7 of the total 15 board members, with other Texas Board of Education Republicans often voting to support this bloc's initiatives. In their 2010 revision of the Texas Social Studies Standards, the conservatively controlled board removed the Seneca Falls Convention, as well as women's suffrage activist Carrie Chapman Catt from the standards. They also removed Harriet Tubman from the list of examples of good citizenship and increased the inclusion of Christianity throughout. Other changes included swapping Martin Luther King Day Jr. with Veterans Day as holidays students should know about, removing Thomas Jefferson from a list of people whose writings inspired revolutions, removing food, clothing, and shelter from the list of basic human needs, and changing the word capitalism to the phrase free enterprise throughout, while only emphasizing capitalism's perceived benefits. Further, the revised standards downplayed slavery and minimalized the incarceration and internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. That's why I made them so small up there. I don't know if you can see them. As history scholar Eric Foner explains in his sharp summary of the Texas Board of Education Social Studies Standards, more interesting is what the new standards tell us about conservatives' overall vision of American history and society and how they hope to instill that vision in the young. Judging from the updated social studies curriculum, conservatives want students to come away from a Texas education with a favorable impression of women who adhere to traditional gender roles, the Confederacy, some parts of the Constitution, capitalism, the military, and religion. They do not think students should learn about women who demanded greater equality, other parts of the Constitution, slavery, Reconstruction, and the unequal treatment of non-whites generally, environmentalists, labor unions, federal economic relations, or foreigners. This conservative, end quote. This conservative vision of U.S. history mattered to the Texas Board of Education and the constituencies who voted them into office. They are democratically elected, because the conservative members of the board were concerned about student consciousness and epistemology as they learn about and subsequently will act within the world. As Texas Board of Education member and self-proclaimed Christian activist Cynthia Dunbar explained, the philosophy of the classroom in one generation will be the philosophy of the government in the next. While Texas provides a shining star of an example of conservative curriculum and hegemonic consciousness, it is important to note that it doesn't shine as a lone star. As Bill Bigelow from Rethinking Schools points out, the social studies standards of his home state of Oregon share many of the same overall pro-capitalist, individualist, and nationalist politics as Texas. In California's standards, Christine Sleeter finds an explicit support for manifest destiny and an assumption that students should identify with a Western Judeo-Christian we against a non-Western, non-Judeo-Christian them. Similarly, as the Arizona Department of Education banned the teaching of ethnic studies, and Arizona State Superintendent of Schools Tom Horn has openly maintained that the only knowledge that should be taught in schools should be that which originated in Western or Greco-Roman civilization. Given the very conservative political turn in the U.S., one can understand why I might feel more than a bit embattled about multicultural education, and it is a really it's an important time for us to support it. It's a good fight to be engaged in. The third point driving my talk today is epistemological, and the conservative politics of the Texas Board of Education help set the stage here. In Texas, we see an example of how the reality of history isn't what is important in today's political discourse. Rather, the Texas example illustrates how the selective interpretation and constructed narrative of history is key, whether or not such interpretation and narrative are connected to what actually happened. You see, right now, I'm concerned with the politics of relativity, and particularly what I see as sort of a disconnect between reality and the selective interpretation of history. In our current context, media outlets like Fox News and political groups like the Tea Party seemingly shape reality by simply stating that things are true. Recent examples might include Sarah Palin's assertion of quote-unquote death panels in healthcare reform, and the quote-unquote birthers movement conviction that President Obama is a non-citizen Muslim with a fake birth certificate. With no basis in material reality, these assertions gain traction in mainstream media, and now many in the United States either believe these things to be true or potentially as bad. They have been left open to entertaining these assertions as possibly true within the framework of their common sense. Sadly, such assertions seem to be enough to gain political traction these days, and reality doesn't seem to actually matter. The construction of reality based on the assertions of individuals or individual groups could be referred to as epistemological subjectivity or perhaps epistemological relativity. This is what Stephen Colbert refers to in his now famously coined term, quote, truthiness, which by his definition, it doesn't matter if something is actually true, it just needs to feel true. Now, I know that I'm taking a stance that is very critical of relativity and subjectivity. In doing so, I want to be clear about a couple of things. First, I need to acknowledge the power of feminist, post-colonial, and postmodern critiques of master narratives that gained momentum in the 1990s and actually started way in the 70s. I'm indebted to these paradigms, all of which relied on epistemological relativity and subjectivity to stake their claims in the humanities and social sciences. Through hard-fought struggle and pain, people of color, women, folks from the LGBTQ community, amongst other groups, have forcefully asserted that, yes, we are here whether you like it or not. The effect of this cannot be overstated and has certainly played a key role in my own development. Second, I want to stress that as anyone knows me knows, I am all about counter-narrative and questioning things critically. However, the conservative right in this country has been extremely effective at taking the left's penchant for critique and spinning it out of orbit, nearly disconnecting it from any basis in material reality back here on Earth. We have reached a level of epistemological subjectivity in our political discourse that is, quite frankly, dangerous. In a sense, you might say we've reached a peak of neoliberalism in political discourse. All narratives are now created equally to compete on the marketplace of ideas. Reality be damned. We can see the danger in this in the large sense with folks like the birthers, but it affects education too. It certainly exists within the bipartisan and corporate insistence on education reforms that are either completely unproven to work or proven not to work. And it exists in curricular reforms that functionally write certain groups and individuals out of the history books, as I mentioned about Texas. All of this puts us interested in multicultural education and teaching for social justice in a peculiar and potentially uncomfortable place. In the past, epistemological subjectivity and relativity has been our friend. We have relied on it to say that rich, white, heterosexual, able-bodied men do not have a monopoly on the truth. And instead, we've asserted that the voices and views of women and people of color, for instance, are real, important, and valid. It's really a cornerstone of multicultural education. But now such epistemological subjectivity has in some ways become our enemy. By entertaining all perspectives as equally valid, we've lost track of hegemony, of power, of racism, of structural and systematic inequalities. It has all simply become a matter of competing narratives in the free market of ideas. Suddenly, reality is what we make it. Ironically, the election, and sadly, the election of President Obama may have effectively sealed the deal on this issue. We are now supposedly in a post-racial society, and in a post-racial society, racism is merely a matter of perception. For myself, as a scholar, an educator, a public intellectual, and an education activist, the tension between epistemological relativity and the existence of material reality has laid at the heart of much of my work. In my most recent book, Critical Curriculum Studies, I consider how to address this tension in our approach to curriculum and, by extension, multicultural education. To do this, I've turned to what's known as standpoint theory. So, standpoint theory formally originated with Lukács and his elaboration of what's called proletarian standpoint, a concept which he himself drew from Marx's discussion of how different economic classes experience alienation from the production of commodities under capitalism in qualitatively different ways. Lukács then extends this argument to literally take up how different ways of understanding the world are implicated by different class locations within capitalism, where his analysis suggests that, quote, every method is necessarily implicated in the existence of the relevant class, and that, quote, the proletariat finds itself repeatedly confronted with the problem of its own point of departure in its efforts to increase its theoretical grasp of reality. In the 1970s and 80s and through the 90s, critical feminist scholars like the University of Washington's own Professor Nancy Hartsock, and I would highly recommend folks take her class. I haven't worked with her, but I have friends who have, and she does teach a whole class on, like, they deal with standpoint theory in length in her class. But Hartsock drew on the concept of proletarian standpoint to challenge both masculinist norms and regressive gender politics found in scientific research. Sandra Harding as well is the other major player in this. Standpoint theory basically operates on the premise that there are some perspectives on society from which the real relations of humans with each other and with the natural world are not visible. I guess there's some ways it's common sense, right? You don't know everything because you can't see everything. And what follows, I'm going to offer a sketch of standpoint theory, and it's essentially a synthesis of both Hartsock and Harding. So it's my read and putting them together. Hartsock might take umbrage with this. I'm not sure. We haven't had an exchange, but we'll see. I should talk to her sometime. Basically, through my synthesis, I've kind of boiled down standpoint to 5 main points. First, standpoint theory asserts that our material experiences, social relations included, structure our epistemology of the world in ways that both limit and enable certain ways of understanding. That is to say, our social locations both enable us to see and understand the world more clearly with respect to our positionality, and they place limits on our ability to understand the world beyond that same positionality. Second, because our experience in material life is embedded in and structured by systems of domination and rule that are organized hierarchically around power relations like race, class, gender, sexuality, nationality, the epistemologies available to groups in power generally contradict and run counter to the epistemologies of groups with less power, forming epistemological inversions of each other. Put a little more simply, by nature of their different experiences from within their social locations, the ruler's view of the world will in many ways be oppositional to that of the ruled. Third, because differentials in power and how such power manifests unequally in social, cultural, and political institutions, including universities, the perspectives of those in power are made functional in the lives of everyone regardless of position because, as Hartsock explains, quote, the ruling group can be expected to structure the material relations in which all people are forced to participate, and because, according to Harding, quote, all are forced to live in social structures and institutions designed to serve the oppressor's understandings of self and society. Put differently, we might say that the unequal distribution of power leads to the unequal distribution of epistemologies, where those with more power can exert stronger influence on our common sense understandings of the world, even if such common sense understandings fundamentally operate as distorted conceptions of material reality. Again, that goes back to the truthiness factor, I think. Fourth, as a consequence of the previous, a standpoint is always born of struggle against the hegemonic epistemology of those in power, making it a quote-unquote achievement that requires active conscious work. Subsequently, according to Harding, a standpoint must be struggled for against the apparent realities made quote-unquote natural and obvious by dominant institutions. And as Hartsock explains, it is an activity of which, quote, requires both systematic analysis and the education that can only grow from the political struggle to change those relations. As such, we can never assume that a standpoint is simply given by one social location. Just because one comes from a marginalized or less powerful group, less powerful social location, does not mean that one automatically has taken up a standpoint. People from oppressed groups can and do maintain forms of consciousness that are regressive, just as people from dominant groups can also develop forms of consciousness that are progressive, too. Rather, a standpoint arises from a conscious resistance struggle against the prevailing and hegemonic form of consciousness that supports unequal social and economic relations. Fifth, The taking up a standpoint by the oppressed and the marginalized carries with it the potential for liberation because, as Hartog says, it, quote, makes visible the it says, quote, makes visible the inhumanity of relations among beings, and such visibility is a critical prerequisite in the process of taking action. Okay, its origins within feminism withstanding, it is critical to recognize that standpoint theory is not a singularly feminist project, especially if we define feminism as solely being about, quote unquote, women's issues. Rather, as Harding explains, the subject of liberatory feminist knowledge must also be, in an important if controversial sense, the subject of every other liberatory knowledge project. This is true in the collective sense of subjective knowledge because lesbian, poor, and racially marginalized women are all women, and therefore feminists will have to grasp how gender, race, and class, and sexuality are used to construct each other. Hence, standpoint has to contend with issues of power and oppression in general, since, as a paradigmatic orientation, standpoint openly acknowledges that the social location of the marginalized and the less powerful is the best advantage for starting knowledge projects and provides the clearest, most truthful lens for understanding a world where the powerful dominate knowledge construction and validation. Hence, standpoint argues that we can achieve more objective understandings from an objectively existing world, not only by recognizing subjectivity in our epistemology, but also by consciously embracing our subjectivity and actively just reflecting on it within our environments. Harding calls this strong objectivity. And I hope you, like, in education, the word objectivity is like, it causes a knee-jerk reaction. Like, we've been running from that, and rightfully so, because of the positive sciences and the whole idea of, like, that you can be completely objective in your research. What I've really liked about standpoint theory is that it's asking for a form of strong objectivity that actually embraces subjectivity and sort of turns objectivity on its head. So I'm not afraid to use this term, but in part because I believe a material world does exist outside of our perception. All right. So, as Harding puts it, strong objectivity requires that the subject of knowledge be placed on the same critical causal plane as objects of knowledge. Thus, strong objectivity requires what we can think of as strong reflexivity. The subject of knowledge, the individual, and the historical located social community whose unexamined beliefs its members are likely to hold unknowingly, so to speak, must be considered as part of the object of knowledge. Strong objectivity means that we gain a better, clear, and more truthful, more strongly objective understanding of social and material relations from the achievement of a standpoint in our knowledge projects. Standpoint theory thus provides a particularly robust justification for taking up a politics of social justice in our teaching, as well as the strongest framework for understanding the politics of knowledge in the curriculum. So now, based on my own experience and our current social-political context, I would argue that it is crucial that standpoint theory be brought more substantively, and consciously into our curriculum on both political and epistemological grounds. Politically, the struggle over school knowledge needs standpoint because conservative forces continue to advance their cultural and intellectual agendas in education through a variety of means, including neoliberal privatization, neoconservative politics, and the hegemonic control of knowledge through standards, as well as textbooks and, of course, high-stakes testing. Any struggle over knowledge, however, is also a struggle over epistemology, a struggle over whose understanding counts and what perspectives and politics that understanding carries with it. Put differently, we must ask the question, whose perception of reality is considered or constructed as valid or invalid in school knowledge, and why? In this regard, as I discussed above, standpoint theory and its explicit focus on social location establishes the struggle over social and material reality as a basis for epistemology. And it's this struggle that provides the strongest grounds for progressive social justice curriculum projects. So drawing on standpoint theory, I want to suggest a way to conceive of what I call curricular standpoint. First, curricular knowledge, as an extension of material and social relations, structures our understanding of the world in ways that is both limiting and enabling. In this sense, the curriculum itself communicates epistemologies associated with particular social locations, and in doing so creates potentialities for understanding the world more clearly or in more obscurity relative to such locations. Second, because schools and school knowledge are embedded in and structured by systems of domination and rule that are organized hierarchically around power relations, the curricular knowledge asserted by groups in power generally supports status quo hegemonic social relations and epistemologies. This curricular knowledge thus often contradicts and runs counter to the epistemologies and curricular knowledge advanced by oppressed groups. Put differently, the curriculum of the ruler will in many ways be oppositional to the curriculum of the ruled. Third, because of unequal power relations, the curricular perspectives of those in power are made operational in generally hegemonic and common sense forms in school knowledge for everyone, regardless of social location, and regardless of whether or not such perspectives are congruent with or contradict material and social realities of students and their communities. Put differently, the unequal distribution of power leads to the unequal distribution of curricular knowledge, where those with more power can exert stronger influence on our common sense understandings of the world vis-a-vis curriculum, even if such common sense understandings fundamentally operate as distorted conceptions of what's actually happening. Fourth, curricular standpoint, because school knowledge is always embedded with dominant power relations, is thus always born of struggle against those very same power relations. In this sense, curricular standpoint is achieved, not given, because it arises from active, systematic, and conscious work. Again, curricular standpoint carries with it the potential for human liberation because it works to reveal unequal social and material relations as a part of a process which can lead to the taking of action to change those relations. Hence, curricular standpoint helps in the development of what Sandoval calls oppositional consciousness, as students potentially develop ways of understanding the world that can trigger their own resistance to both status quo knowledge, to status quo knowledge, which in turn develops their capacity to take transformational action, both individually and socially. Additionally, curricular standpoint requires that we seek to develop strong objectivity relative to curricular knowledge, and that we be strongly reflexive not only about the standpoint of knowledge itself, but also strongly reflexive about the origins, politics, and process of how knowledge makes its way into the curriculum. Indeed, curricular standpoint is a product of strong objectivity, as it immediately and explicitly recognizes the politics of knowledge in such a way that places the curriculum itself on the same plane as the subject of knowledge contained within the curriculum. Now, I would assert that curricular standpoint actually provides a pretty strong argument for multicultural education in our schools. My reasoning is that curricular standpoint requires that we engage in arguments about material and social reality, because standpoint, as discussed above, takes as its basis that the perspectives and life experiences of the marginalized or oppressed provide a clear, more objective starting points for understanding the world. And we can use standpoint to wage a particularly robust defense for multicultural education. Using race and culture as one axis of analysis, the perspectives of people of color become central to understanding social and material realities, because those experiences, as peoples whose knowledge is marginalized within the current social, historical, and institutional context, provides stronger objectivity with regards to systems of racism, a reality which is obscured within dominant perspectives. Granted, one can just simply argue whether or not race-conscious standpoint of, granted, one can argue whether or not the race-conscious standpoint of people of color is valid or invalid simply by arguing about whether or not racism exists. However, standpoint theory can take up, and I think ultimately win this argument, because it relies on the epistemological claim that we can look at the material and social realities easily, just have to present data regarding people's group experiences and testimony regarding individual experiences, and illustrate quite clearly that racial disparities, as evidence of racism, do in fact actually exist. And we've done this a lot already. Consequently, the grounds for argument that arise from standpoint revolve around the actual material and social existence of people. What curricular standpoint then brings to a defense of multicultural education is the position that if we want a fuller, more true representation of what exists in the world, if we want to actually understand the world as it exists, then we prioritize the perspectives of people of color and other marginalized groups in our curriculum. All right, so let's get back to a little bit of practice. I know I got heady for about 15 minutes there, and let's come back to the ground a little bit. Although they are not explicitly articulated as such, there already exists a number of lesson plan collections and curricula that I think take up curricular standpoint. These books include These include books such as Putting the Movement Back into Civil Rights Teaching, Resistance in Paradise, Beyond Heroes and Holidays, and just about every publication offered by Rethinking Schools, among others. And one of my hats as editor is I'm always doing a sell job, so you'll get the hard pitch from me. And right now what I want to do is use Linda Christensen's article, Putting Out the Linguistic Welcome Mat, as a brief but concrete example of curricular standpoint and practice. In this piece, Linda Christensen, who's also Rethinking Schools editor, discusses her curriculum on language and power and includes classroom strategies and resources that she uses with her high school language arts students. As Christensen explains, this should come up, okay. During 30 years as a language arts classroom teacher, I realized that if I wanted my students to open up in their writing, to take risks, and engage in intellectually demanding work, I needed to challenge assumptions about the superiority of standard English and the inferiority of the home language of many of my black students, African American Vernacular English, or Ebonics. I finally realized that I needed to create a curriculum on language and power that examined the roots of language supremacy and analyzed how schools perpetuate the myths of the inferiority of some languages. Using a variety of films, readings, and writing activities, Christensen introduces her students to the origins and grammatical rules of African American Vernacular English, and with stunning effect. As she recounts, her African American students learned that AAVE, African American Vernacular English, actually has systematic linguistic roots in West African culture. They actively began to challenge forms of internalized racism they had taken in relative to their home languages. Further, Christensen highlights how this curriculum aided students in the development of a metacognitive understanding of not only the structures of African American Vernacular English, but also the relationship between African American Vernacular English and Standard English, and thus created the potential for these students to take conscious action relative to their own educational futures through an applied awareness of linguistic tools such as code switching. Oh, sorry. Okay. Now, Christensen's classroom practice clearly takes up curricular standpoint. She explicitly acknowledges the ways in which social relations and systems of domination exist within classroom knowledge and linguistic practice, in an attempt to have her curriculum reflect the social and material realities of her African American students and an embrace of the ways in which language intertwines with culture and identity. Christensen's curriculum thus takes up the standpoint of a marginalized form of the English language, and thus also takes up the standpoint of a marginalized racial cultural group within the United States. In the process, she works with students to uncover linguistic relationships that may have been previously obscured that may have been previously obscured from student consciousness. Further, Christensen's curricular standpoint represents a conscious act on the teacher's part, something that, after having reflected on years of teaching, she had to work to achieve in her practice. Additionally, we see that this curricular standpoint is also about action, in that Christensen also sees her curriculum as providing her students with an increased ability to develop their writing skills, a pedagogic move that requires action on both the part of the teacher and the students. Finally, although Christensen uses AAVE as her starting point, she's quick to point out that the resources she uses actually speak to a wide range of non-standard forms of English language. Thus, the issue for Christensen is a validation of home languages, regardless of the cultural specifics of one's home. All right. Was going to talk about Rico Gutstein's work in mathematics as sort of another example, but we're running up on time, so I'm going to skim through that. Okay. So Linda's was just one example. Rico's would have been another. And, I'm sure we could find many more. I do know that if I were in a high school classroom today, and sometimes I wish I still was, I miss the students. The high school students that I worked with it's a different energy than my college students. And there's no offense to my college students at all. I know that if I were in a high school classroom teaching today, you could bet that I would be working with my students to interrogate economic inequality in this country and its relationship to the Occupy Wall Street movement. Remember, pretty much all of our public school students are part of the 99%. I started my talk today by relaying some of my experience as a teacher at Middle College High School at South Seattle Community College, and I'm going to end there as well. The more I reflect back on my students and the curriculum we taught there, the more I feel the weight of alienation that my students were feeling and that we, as their teachers, were desperately trying to overcome. Fundamentally, our students were alienated from just about everything in their lives. They were often alienated from their families, with distressed relations defining their home lives more often than not. They certainly found themselves alienated from their educational experiences, where they couldn't find meaningful connections to the teachers, school structures, and curriculum. You could say they were experiencing epistemological alienation in that their knowledge was separated from their being. Most distressingly, I think, they were alienated from their very selves, with many feeling as if they had no power over their own lives and their futures. Caught up in surviving the everyday experience, our students entered middle college rarely understanding the big picture, the patterns, the social processes, the history, the institutional relationships operating through and manifesting in their lives. As I discussed earlier, a highlight of our middle college curriculum came in 1999 when the massive protests against the World Trade Organization took place here in Seattle. It really was the ultimate teachable moment for us that fall. It was a powerful time to be in the city, with activists, demonstrators, and a whole lot of regular folks, yes, even families with babies and strollers, all coming together to voice a collective opposition to the anti-democratic and anti-environmental economic policies of the World Trade Organization. To build for this event and to help students make sense of the flurry of media surrounding both the meetings and the protests, we studied the World Trade Organization and how systems of free trade impacted students' lives and communities locally. We want our students to understand that the WTO wasn't just some far-flung organization in the abstract, and that the resistance to WTO policies wasn't similarly distant. Resistance wasn't similarly distant. That there were bigger processes at play, that our students were in fact concretely connected to other folks halfway around the world, and that they could overcome some of their alienation and be part of something bigger. When the first official day of mass protests came, we shut down the school. Many of our parents, out of fear of the general tumult of the day, simply told their children to stay home anyways. For some of us teachers, participating in demonstrations was of critical importance, and we would have called in substitutes and taken sick days if we had to as well. While we did not legally have a field trip to the WTO demonstrations, several of our students chose to meet us on their own accord in downtown Seattle. Let me just say that if you've never been to a demonstration with tens of thousands of people, or better yet, hundreds of thousands, as was the case with the anti-Gulf War protests in San Francisco that took place a couple years after, I highly recommend it. Seriously, it's something you just got to do it, and then you'll see. It's a powerful experience that invites shifts in consciousness, is a powerful experience that invites shifts in consciousness, which we saw in most of the students who participated in the protests. As one of our students, DJ Niebuhr, wrote in a reflective poem he entitled Bombshells. Bombshells of canisters, right for human slaves, all brought together, awaken people today. Inside this peaceful parade, the righteous have been sprayed by an ignorant army in hopes of some delays, but we stopped them, we did. Delegates and corporate leaders, the power of all, a right to stand for freedom. Each and every one took part in a march for human life, took time from their work, school, and daily life. For the innocent, many who have not been given a life, we all lay down arms and offer ourselves to sacrifice. Niebuhr's poem is important in that it illustrates the way he made sense of the day's events. Of particular note is the way he connects himself with those facing injustice around the world and the protests that day, as well as the power he experienced as the protests literally shut down the WTO meetings. It is this type of connection that we strove for with the middle college curriculum, an antidote to our students' alienation. Very much in the Freirean sense, we wanted them to be objects of history instead of just subjects. We wanted them to be objects really of their own lives. So we connected our curriculum to both the specificities of their social locations as well as to the relations and processes that shaped their material existence. We studied how capitalism systematically produced and relied upon poverty. We tracked institutionalized racism in the justice system, housing, and employment. We looked at how systems of education have generally functioned to reproduce inequality. However, we also buttressed our study of systematic oppression with the powerful stories of resistance. Our students learned about the quilombos, where enslaved Africans escaped, formed communities in Brazil, and heroically fought back against the advancement of European colonizers. They also learned about the Black Panthers, the Brown Berets, and other groups who consciously and deliberately organized against racism and poverty in the U.S. historically. We taught them about heroes like Yuri Kochiyama as well, a Japanese-American woman who worked closely with Malcolm X in Harlem and went on to live a life of resistance and activism. The examples are nearly endless, but our overall hope was that if our students could figure out what was structuring their lives in such terribly alienating ways and see how models of people have overcome similar alienation, they could then also identify what power they had to negotiate those structures and make changes, both big and small, in their own lives. And to me, this alone is the point of thinking about curriculum critically. And that's it. Thank you.
I'll field his own questions. I'll just make sure they stop at 11:30.
Okay.
That's all. Questions? Just raise your hand. I don't think we have mics, but if you shout, you just raise.
Hi, Phyllis. Garfield class of 90 as well.
Definitely, thank you. This is a great talk. And I know I missed part of it, so you may have answered this already, but what do you think would be some challenges of teaching this type of curriculum and material to privileged students?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. A colleague of mine, Katie Solwell, who is at George Mason University, actually did her dissertation on doing sort of social justice teaching to privileged groups. The challenge is privilege blinds us. So if you want to, I mean, essentially, when you think about standpoint, like privilege puts us in a position where where we can't see some things. And so what this type of curriculum would do is sort of actually run up against that privilege. And so there's always resistance. There's always resistance. The good thing is that I think if you approach it correctly, you know, everybody has some angle they can take on I would say, marginalization, and use as a window to understand other people's experiences, you know? I mean, if there's one thing that's brilliant about the 99% campaign is that that's an easy, like, you know, as things have gotten so much worse, yes, more and more people are feeling it, and suddenly there's a space to use maybe some economic alienation to help challenge other forms of oppression or other inequalities. You just literally using it as a window. So, but it's absolutely a challenge. I run into it. As a teacher educator, you run into it all the time because our cohorts are usually about 85, 90% middle class white students, and you know, and again, this is not to say like, I mean, these are good folks who want to be good teachers, but they often aren't aware of some of the biases or prejudices that they bring into the classroom, and so you know, we end up running into those in class on a semi-regular basis. So, yeah.
Hi. I'm wondering about really kind of your thoughts on the possibility of an activist and what I see as massive technocratization, if that's a word, of public schools now. Certainly down in Tacoma, where we have widespread infiltration, and I have to say my own institution is partially responsible for this, of things like direct instruction, program instruction, scripted education. Like, I'm even wondering where kind of the opportunity or possibilities of these are, except for sort of isolated, marginalized institutions.
I think public education and public school teachers are in perhaps one of the toughest spots they've been in maybe ever, with regards to this kind of stuff, right? I mean, high stakes testing and the squishing of the curriculum and the scripted reading, in the midst of, in conjunction with a political discourse where teachers are being blamed for everything, right? And so to resist at that moment can clearly be career suicide. I mean, literally, like you can just get fired by your principal. I mean, that's what's going on. So I'm like sympathetic for any teacher in that position, and I think at this exact moment, I think the main space for resistance is in in select pockets, but it depends on your community. It depends on your particular administration. Yeah, I think it. Yep. But I do think we're heading towards something much more massive, because I don't think we can head in this trajectory for another 10 years without teachers just saying enough, without parents just saying enough. And that's the other part of this puzzle. Is I think the other piece of this puzzle is that I think that we need to be organizing more with parents, and as teachers. Like, parents are super powerful, and they just don't necessarily know it all the time. When a small group of parents goes in and talk to a principal, principals usually whoa, freak out. Okay, and I mean that good and bad. We had we had one set of very conservative parents. When I taught at Berkeley High, it's a big school, 3,500 students. Taught at Berkeley High, there was one set of conservative parents, and it was a very radical school. They made a couple complaints and literally would change the whole school policy. This is one pair of parents, right? So parents are really powerful. And there are groups like the Save Our Schools movement and Parents Across America who are organizing against the scripted curriculum and standardized testing, and we've seen Diane Ravitch sort of move in that direction, almost astonishingly. And so I think there's a movement building, and you can, the strike in Tacoma was a great example. People. Middle-class professionals, it takes a lot to move them into action in terms of activist action and protest. But when things get bad enough, they get there. And I think also the 99% of the Occupy Wall Street stuff points that direction too. I mean, you have college graduates out there, yelling about the distribution of wealth, because they can't find jobs, right? So I feel like things are moving in that direction, and I think we can get there. I just think at this exact second, we're not quite there yet.
Can you hear me in the back? Could you stand and talk in your fifth grade voice? I'm sorry we don't have a mic out there.
Well, I have a question about, you mentioned a little bit, you touched on the role of families and communities. So I think, one observation that I make in my own work is that more and more families and communities are having less to say about what happens in classrooms and in schools. So what do you think, how do you think, this analysis of curriculum and connecting it to the broader issues, what do you feel is how do parents fit into that dialogue and that interaction? Because it doesn't seem like, at least in my experience, that it hasn't played a very strong role.
Yeah.
It feels essential, so what do you feel are some ways that engage in that dialogue?
Yeah, well, a couple angles to that. One, in my advocation for in advocating for standpoint theory in the curriculum, obviously it's about, you'd have to bring students, homes, and communities into the curriculum. That's part of it. So from just a sort of theoretical perspective, I definitely see that driving a lot of the work that I've been trying to do. Again, to me, it's a complicated picture. So on the one hand, we have we have the tests and the textbooks and the standards. So we have this outside body telling teachers how to teach, and then you have teachers as a professional body, often resistant to the input of parents on what goes in the classroom too, right? And so, I was a former public school teacher, and I'll own that generally. That teachers have, parent night comes along, and my colleagues would literally tell me, okay, plan your presentation, don't let them ask questions, right? And so there has been historically a culture amongst teachers about sort of defending themselves, defending their territory against parents, and we have to stop that. We just have to. And just in the same way that I think parents are powerful allies for education reform stuff, teachers need to see parents as powerful curriculum allies. And there's ways to do it. The problem is we're also overtaxed. So having 170 students a day doesn't make it like you have a lot of time to spend all of your evenings calling all 170, parents or guardians of your students, right? That's that's serious. So I would, it all just piles on top of each other. Teachers need more space and capacity to plan and be their professional selves as teachers, and that I think would have to allow for also creating some structured space to facilitate conversations with parents. And we know that's difficult too.
So, thank you for your talk. It's very interesting, and I think.
Very cool.
Sorry. So I'm wondering, you were just mentioning teachers and professional development. So my understanding of Prairie was that he pointed out that you don't get it right the first time, and you just constantly are trying to do it better the next time, with that critical reflection that goes on and on. So presumably, somebody adopting something like this, that would also be kind of the wrong word, right? So enacting it, trying to take it up, they'd have to continue reflecting over time about how they got it right. So I'm wondering if you have any ideas about how you create that sort of context or space for educators to be reflecting on how effectively they're doing this, or...
Oh, yeah, we're still running the same problems. It's like teachers are on the treadmill, and they don't have that space. In terms of professional development, man, I don't know. I'm just so sympathetic to teachers right now because I know they're just tired, And I've been myself, I've been in a lot of bad professional development as a K-12 teacher too, and so I get nervous. Yeah, I think, for instance, like one thing, for instance, Seattle Public Schools. Once upon a time, I had entertained the idea of applying for a position. This is before I got the job at UW-Bothell, of being trying the head of curriculum, not knowing that there was no chance in hell I would have got the job just because of who was superintendent at the time. But one of the ideas I was thinking, can you imagine if we had an active bank of teacher-developed curriculum that teachers collected and used and shared with each other, right? And went back in and revised and changed. This would be something that I think that should have all public schools ought to have, and then teachers ought to have time to contribute to this and have that kind of interaction. So to me, it's about a teacher-centered, in a way, sort of a little bit anarchistic in the sense of it's teachers talking to teachers and having exchanges of good teaching ideas and sharing resources, and then using that space also to reflect on that curriculum and what they're doing that way. I don't know, it's hard for me to imagine. It's sad, but it would be great to have. And so I could see something like that happening. But you have to have administrative buy-in. And at this moment, we're not going to get administrative buy-in on something like this that I've talked about. It ends up being an active resistance at this point. So, I don't know.
Well, you introduced a number of very interesting terms that actually I was thinking, I'm taking the course on race, gender, and knowledge construction next quarter, and I thought, if I had read your book before, it may have been a good extension, but I can recommend it to my students because I think it's actually an extension of applicability of the course. But you talk about epistemological subjectivity, epistemological alienation. Those are nice terms I think I'll introduce to my students. But one of the things that I thought about as you talk, as you introduced these ideas, was epistemological clash. For example, my wife listens to the liberal version of the news every night. I listen to CNN, you never know where they're going. Then there's Fox News, which neither of us listen to. And every night I search for something that would be in the public interest, and I can't find it. So there's an epistemological clash. So how do you deal with that from the point of view of the classroom in a democratic classroom? So how do you deal with the students who've been watching Fox News, the students who've been watching, what is it, NBCS, what is it called? It's whatever. There's no Walter Cronkite. I said to Jerry, I wish there was a Walter Cronkite who at least pretended that he was neutral. But you can't find it. Our community, our nation is just fractionalized, segmented. You can't. So how do you deal with the epistemological clash in your theoretical framework? And I'm introducing that term, extending the terms that you've introduced.
Yeah, that happens all the time, right? As teachers, whether it's K-12 or university, you run into the epistemological clash because we're all social beings, and we're all our common sense is just shaped by our life experiences and what we study, and so we're all getting this, all this massive stuff all the time. Anyways, we're interacting with media and everything else. So, for me, with students, it's always about inquiry, right? And so, if we have this epistemological clash pop up, and you have sort of competing versions of what's going on, okay, let's explore it, right? The problem is you need curriculum. You need flexibility enough in time and curriculum and resources to be able to devote to those kind of explorations. But I think it's critical that students do that. Sometimes, though, I think it's also important to present students with information that just rubs up against their perspectives too. Force the clash so that it makes them confront the potentiality that maybe they misunderstand something. That can breed resistance, so it can be risky to do that sometimes too. But I definitely believe in doing both those things. So.
Yeah, and I just have a follow-up, and then I'll open it up again. And this gives me a chance to push another book. In the multiple series I have at the Teachers College Press, there's a wonderful new book by two of my former students, Robin DiAngelo and Osman Sensor, called Is Everyone Really Created Equal? Or Is Everyone Really Equal? And what they point out is just a follow-up to your the statement you just made, that when we find these kind of ideological clash in the classroom, and actually I'm going to make a quote from Jim Loewen, who's also has a book in the series, but his more famous book is, what's it called, Sherry? Lies and Teachers Taught Me. Well, what Jim points out in his book, that when you find out these epistemological clash, one of the things you can point out to students is that everybody is entitled to their opinion, but not to their own facts.
Yeah.
That's a quote from Jim Loewen.
Yeah, that's a great book.
Other questions? We have time for a couple more before we open up the book sale. Yes, this young woman.
What are some examples you've seen that you like on the elementary education level?
Things like, Bob Peterson at Rethinking Schools, who's a fourth grade teacher. Right now he's actually president of the Milwaukee Teachers Union, which is proving to be interesting, so to speak. People really think public education is going to end in Milwaukee, literally, like the way things are going right now. But Bob's fourth grade teacher, and all of his stuff ends up being elementary level. So if you look at the book like Rethinking Columbus, at least half of that is sort of elementary level stuff on how to sort of do sort of a counter narrative on the traditional Columbus narrative and Thanksgiving and that kind of stuff. And I'm just going to keep plugging. So this next year, Rethinking Schools is also going to put out Rethinking Elementary Education, which is just an elementary ed book through and through. And that's going to have tons of stuff. So, it's out there, and there's more than just Rethinking Schools stuff. Zen Education Project is a great website that you all should just go if you want curriculum materials. The folks over at Teaching for Change out in D.C. Have great stuff. So it's out there, and it's around. It's easy enough to find. I think.
Also, Wayne brought his catalog. That's right.
Yes, I did.
And Rethinking Schools really does have a lot of good stuff. Linda Darling-Hammond is one of their strong supporters. We'll take one or two more questions. Yes. Maurice.
Thank you, Todd. Question, as a former high school teacher myself, always struggled to find utility with most of the things that came out of universities for me as an in-the-classroom teacher.
Uh-huh.
So what roles do you see in particular research university and college education, like Doug asked, what roles do you see them having in particular for informing teachers in the classroom and their practice?
I think there's a lot of possibility from offering professional development as the most basic thing, and making yourself available to teachers and districts. Let's see, I actually, for me personally, I've been working really hard, for instance, to sort of embrace myself as a public intellectual that way, and so making myself available to local media and sort of figuring out ways to talk about, say, for instance, education policy that are more popular and not just written for academia. Same thing with curriculum stuff. I also think it's important for professors and academics to get connected to local networks of teachers as well who are doing good work in the schools. So, for instance, there's a local Puget Sound Rethinking Schools group here that I helped co-found actually when I was a K-12 teacher here in Seattle, but it still exists and it's still predominantly K-12 teachers, and we help organize a conference and that kind of stuff. So there's ways to be on the ground and bring your research to bear with folks. But I think the thing is just we have as university professors, we have a fair amount of privilege and we have access to resources. Even the research databases is like the smallest thing. So I've had teachers email me like, I'm having this struggle with this, with my principal about this thing. Do you know any research that can help me talk about this. And so I can spend a few minutes looking for a few key articles and say, here, use this. That just happened with someone who had a foundation that they were arguing about charter schools and whether or not they were serving students in special education and English language learners, right? And so even just figuring out ways to bring that sort of privilege, that access to resources to bear in very concrete ways that can help teachers in the struggles that they're doing is sort of...
I have a follow-up to Maurice. I just got through looking at Edward Said's book on the role of public intellectuals at the university. He said one of our roles is to speak truth to power, almost no one else does. You get in front of power, it's very easy to just say what they want to hear. And this happens at the university, it happens everywhere. But Said said that one of our roles as public intellectual in the university is to speak truth to power. It's not easy. Easier said than done.
Especially as a junior professor who doesn't have tenure yet. It's too late. It's too late, Jim. I'm already.
That's me and Jerry. Yeah, that's another question.
I'm thinking about teachers trying to enact stuff, sort of, use the word I can't remember, but sort of like working outside of standards. But I'm thinking about curriculum departments, and I mean, I function in the curriculum department in the school district, and there are lots of folks who are curriculum specialists who really want to know more. And I keep being struck by how curriculum specialists in districts are functioning, trying to enable their teachers to teach equitably, to make sure all students have access, for example, in my grade, to all the mathematics, and how does that interplay with networking with people here to help with critical curriculum theory. There's a layer of folks who are really trying to work hard on that, and the policy level, because really, if we're going to change things, it has to be the policy level with curriculum departments and school boards and communities. And I don't know how to tease out all of those complicated pieces. I don't know how to formulate my question, but there's something there that needs help.
Yeah, and it's super complicated, right? School boards, different layers of administration that may have competing views of how to do things within school districts. Yep. Yeah, I mean, personally, if Seattle Schools approached me as a curriculum consultant to help them think through this stuff, I would gladly do it. But it's politics, and they're not going to approach me. They'll approach Broad or Pearson or somebody, right? That'll be a little more corporate, So
Professor Mitchell, and then our good professor colleague from Basel, then we'll end. Professor Mitchell.
I had a question about your choice of standpoint theory as a vehicle for a social justice project, and I'm really sympathetic to standpoint theory, which is basically giving yourself permission to take a stand that has some degree of closure to it. And I'm also sympathetic to your frustration with post-structuralist theory that is in this radical undecidability, complexity, non-representational.
Yeah.
So BS to a certain point in time when you're like, well, what about the real world?
You got this is my nice version. Yeah.
My question really leads from Jim's excellent point about epistemological clash, and it isn't just the sort of Fox News versus Rachel Maddow.
No.
There's a clash on the left too that we really have to kind of acknowledge. And as someone who, when I take a standpoint, it's a feminist, Marxist, anti-colonial, anti-racist person, but unfortunately, many of my colleagues I really love in a lot of ways, that's not their position. It's in the last instance, it's the economic.
Yeah.
Or in the last instance, it's patriarchy.
Yeah.
And so when you take a standpoint, you're assuming everybody is agreeing that we're all fighting the good fight in the same sort of wavelength, and you're taking that to your curriculum. But in fact, perhaps a better, and this is why I tend more towards looking at Stuart Hall's theory of articulation, is because it is one that really forces people to draw together different kinds of clusters that sort of social justice project without getting into the fights that you could get when you take a critical statement.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely hear all that, and I think for me, like the way I think about standpoint, and there's actually a whole range of standpoint, like they fight amongst each other, and who I drew from, both they're definitely more Marxist, and actually more important to me, materialists. Like the epistemological divide is: do you believe there's a material world that exists outside of our perception or not, right? And I do believe that it's there, and that we're working to understand it, and that there's something actually to work with. And that to me is what drives my project. That's how I see standpoint functioning here. And so to me, when I think about approaching those issues, I'm less concerned about the fights, but I'm like, okay, so let's figure out what's really going on and try and fix that. And so I feel like I'm a little more maybe issue-driven, or when I think about trying to bring those folks together more than anything else. So, but I've definitely, I don't know. I've spent a lot of my time really going after the hyper relativity and subjectivity of postmodernism, some forms of feminism. There's all sorts of stuff. I think it's really detrimental. But as a materialist, sometimes I am, especially these days. Like I think as times change, I end up feeling more and more, economy in the last instance. But I still feel like I'm dialectical enough to be able to hold that position, but also recognize that we do have some level of epistemological subjectivity in terms of taking on these projects. So, I don't know.
I just wanted to respond to the last two questions about the role of the university, and in terms of the curriculum specialist in the school, we tend to anytime
Nice job.
Thanks.
Proud of you.
Quick workshop kind of thing, and the stuff that we teach in curriculum studies takes a lot of reflection, a lot of reading, a lot of thought. And so anything that can be devised where there's much more sense of reading through conversation, I love the salon idea.
You can go and respond.
But not like, here's a
I don't know if it's anything to respond to.
curriculum theory. This is just keeps the world so alienated. But I think there's such a need for that to have this conversation. But the other piece is that I've tried a lot in my years working with people becoming teachers as well as experienced teachers, making sure that they're connected to particularly the Rethinking Schools group or innovative educators. So one of the projects that I've been doing pretty regularly for the last couple of years is to have students study curriculum by finding an innovative educator who's dealing with how they're navigating in a standards world, but also that there's sometimes we do social justice curriculum, we're doing music studies, global studies, whatever, and they get inspired by people who are in public schools, are able to teach against the grain and what supports them. And of course, sometimes they find post-school communities that are really innovative. And so then they come out feeling, well, maybe they're not in the majority, but boy, those examples out there. And I've also I've been really very grateful that the Rethinking Schools folks have been willing to come to my classes and talk about how they do stuff in their classes in the community. So I think to see the university as helping to create conversations among the communities, that's a great role we can have.
Actually, your point reminded me of one thing I've forgotten. Actually, it goes back to a couple of points. We need to bring back sabbaticals for public school teachers. It's talk about a radical idea now in this budget climate, right? But honestly, I might not have become a professor and got my PhD if I had a sabbatical available to me, because I was really tired. I had been organizing. I was teaching my butt off, and I was like, I need a break. I'd gotten laid off by Berkeley schools because of the budget crisis, and back then, and so. But I remember after my first semester at Madison and taking some really great classes, and I was like, you know what? I thought to myself, I could go back at this point. Like I had some time to dig into politics and really think deeply about a lot of stuff that was important to me through my classes, and I felt in a space of like, But I think teachers need that. There'd be space to go reflect on curriculum, like take Pam's curriculum studies course at UW-Bothell, right? I mean, to have that space and have that be supported by the institution would be incredible, and I think it would really keep teachers alive and vibrant and energetic. But right now it's a pipe dream. I know, serious.
First of all, before we thank the Professor, I want to invite you to the book signing that's going to take place. Let's give him a real round of applause.
Thank you.